All right, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to move on to chapter 7. So now, in chapter 7, we're now going to go back to talking about the conscious mind, relationship between your negative and positive mind, or your conscious and subconscious mind. And we're going to talk about, specifically in this chapter, we're going to go into much more detail about quantization, right? So what the intention actually does to quantize your subconscious, which causes it to switch to a particular frequency and express itself in a certain way. And as you can see, right, the board is completely empty. I didn't feel like moving things around because this small space, I got to move things around to kind of do my little story time. But I'm going to do not that much of a story time, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about the first section of this chapter in the book, which I basically go a little into kind of how this started a little bit. I go into more detail in the beginning of the book, but it's relevant in this chapter. So I'm just going to talk about it real quick, and then in the next chapter, next video, we'll go back to going over the theory. So for me, when I first started doing this, right, I think I said in the other videos, my whole life, right, I've been very interested in metaphysics and spirituality, and always had an aptitude for pretty much kind of putting things into theory, especially abstract things. Always been that way. Right, so like even when I was a kid, and I was like 15, I think I wrote like a little mini book about spirituality and stuff like that. Well, no, when I was in high school, when I was a tiny bit older, so 17 or 18, but I started kind of getting more into spirituality when I was 15. So that's just always who I was. Never really knew it was anything special, just was something I was interested in. I'm going to talk about natural gifts that people have from God in chapters 10, so basically the end of the book, in the supernatural section, which is book 2, because that plays into that, right? So that's important. But for now, I'll just say that that's always been my interest, right? So occasionally I would just do my little study projects, right, where I try to understand the mind more in more detail, or try to gain more understanding of it. But it's usually in terms of spirituality, right? So that even the little tiny mini book that I wrote in high school was about spirituality, and it was about how to behave in a way to make you more spiritual. It's kind of funny thinking about it, because at the time I didn't know, that was my thing, or that's who I was. I was just doing it, right? That was just on my heart at the time, or on my mind. But anyway, going back to this. So a couple years ago, from the time of this recording, I had the bright idea, right? So, and I kind of say that in jest when I mention that, because I just kind of randomly popped into my head. I was curious to know, right? Because I would read near-death experiences. I think this is where it came from. I read near-death experiences, right? And I would read how they would talk about how they would experience or feel the presence of God, right? And how they would feel so much love and so much peace. And it would be so intense that it was indescribable, right? There's no way they could truly convey it, right? And they would say you can't possibly experience it here on Earth alive. And I became interested in that because it made me think, like, if emotions presumably are metaphysical, right? So they're not physical at all. And I'm like, well, do emotions have a limit, right? Is there some highest level that they can reach, or can they just keep going on forever, right? I still don't really know the answer to that question. But I guess what I was really curious about is whether or not they can reach the level of intensity that's often described in near-death experiences. So I was just interested in that, right? Just randomly was curious to know the answer to that question. And like I said, thoughts like that would pop into my head, and curiosities like that all the time. So this was just literally another one. And so I was interested to know if when emotions reach a high enough level, do the properties of the brain or the body or the mind, and this at that time I had no idea, right? This theory wasn't developed at all. This was actually how it started for the most part. But I didn't know that. I didn't even know the brain. I believed emotions were metaphysical, right? But I didn't necessarily know that or have some invested theory that I, can sort of focus on when I think about emotions and how they work, or any of that stuff. So tacitly, I was still thinking mainly in physical terms. So, yeah, at this time, I just got the idea. I was just curious. What happens when your emotions reach a high enough level of intensity, right? And even then, I guess I was a little bit still curious to know if the answer would lead me to more of a physical framework or paradigm for how emotions work in terms of the mechanics of emotion. because then they shouldn't really be able to go that high at all, right? So yeah, these were just thoughts I had, and I also want to know if your awareness of reality changes in some way, which it does, right? We talked about that with transcendental perception. So your imagination becomes way more intense, right? In terms of how you perceive and sense things in your mind, and in terms of your belief, what becomes rational to you. So it does change, right? But I didn't know at the time. So I was just curious to know if your awareness changes anyway when emotions get really, really intense. And this is similar to physics, right? So I think I mentioned it a little bit about it before. When things get really, 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 really small, do the laws of physics that we perceive in the macroscopic world are they still observable? And we know from quantum mechanics that they're not, right? There are many principles in quantum mechanics that do not show themselves in the macroscopic world, like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, wave-particle duality, the quantum superposition, things like that do not show up in the physical world. So it's only when you get small enough, right, that the true laws of physics start to expose themselves or become easily observable. And I think I mentioned before, same thing, if you're going to really, really, really large scale with gravity, right, it's a lot easier to understand certain things about the nature of gravity. I haven't studied general relativity yet as the time of this recording. I will. Right? I'm kind of ashamed of myself that I still haven't studied it. I do know the basic ideas. But when you study gravity on a large enough scale, like in terms of the universe and planets and solar systems, it gets a lot easier to see certain principles of gravity and how general relativity properly describes gravity, which is the curvature of space-time. And you start to see principles having to do with the way things move that even involve dark matter and dark energy, which are virtually impossible, as far as I know, to see on a smaller scale, right? So when you go large enough or small enough, certain principles of physics are more easily observable. So I wanted to know, right, if emotions go to a really, really, really high level, are there certain properties of awareness and consciousness and emotions that become observable in that sort of intense circumstance, or that sort of special or intense condition. So that's what I was curious about. So I'm like, okay, what I'm going to do is start just making myself feel emotion very, very intensely. Now, again, at this time, I had no idea that I had to charge this, right? So we haven't talked too much about the timing prospect of charging. It would take, generally to reach a really high level of intensity, right? It'd probably take me a couple of days of charging. But at this time, I had no idea things charged. I didn't know about any of that. All I was trying to do was just will myself to feel more emotion. I thought I could feel the most intense amount of emotion possible instantaneously, right? If I just do something with my mind, with my thoughts. And so that's what I started practicing to do. And like I said, I had to pick an emotion, so I at least knew that much, right? So at that time, I wanted to feel that romantic feeling of love emotion more. And I did go on a few dates at that time. They weren't too bad, right? I was always pretty good at going on dates, but I just didn't feel that connection with these chicks at the time. It's a long story, but at this particular time, I was more interested in just feeling that feeling. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to charge it. Well, I'm just going to feel it at will, or will myself to feel it. And so I started practicing that, right? And I just started trying to feel the love emotion just more intensely, just at will, and produce a really huge amount of it. Of course, that was very hard, right? So I had no idea how emotions worked. I thought that I did. I just never tried to do something like that. So I didn't think it was going to be that hard to do if I actually set my mind to it, right? And it was really hard. Because again, I was still thinking like probably the way most people think, right? That emotions work instantaneously, and I was going based on my general experiences of emotion, right? Which most people aren't really paying attention to the charging behavior of emotions. So they mostly only notice what's going on in their subconscious when emotions reach a really intense level. So to them, right, it's usually just, and they would usually describe emotions as just operating at a very high intensity instantaneously from a moment of not having intensity. So that's how I thought. And so I kept trying to will it. I kept like just producing intention, just feel more emotion, right? And it wouldn't work, right? So after a while, I kept practicing more and more. And then I forget how much detail I go into in this section of the book, but suffice it to say, Eventually, I started to be more successful, and I started to I was observing my own emotions and what was causing them to spike and what wasn't. What was causing them to spike and what was causing them to sort of recede. And I would pay attention to that. And eventually I started to see the relationship between what I was doing with my intention and how much emotion I was feeling. And then I started to realize two things, right? So I started to realize, one, that my intention wasn't actually controlling my emotions, which I thought before. In other words, I kind of thought that I could use my conscious mind to control my emotion. I didn't know there was really two minds at the time. I didn't know of the subconscious. I learned about the subconscious for the very first time, right? I was like in my 20s, like 23, I think, right? I just hadn't studied it back then, right? But by this time, I had no idea. At that time, I was studying, like I said before, to be a conversationalist. So that was when I was much younger. But so I knew my subconscious was capable of helping me with creativity and performance. I had no idea emotions came from the subconscious. So when I was practicing this, right, I kept practicing to feel more emotion, to feel it more intensely. Then eventually I realized it wasn't coming from my conscious mind. I don't know if that time I still knew it was my subconscious. I think I did. So eventually I realized it was coming from my subconscious mind, not my conscious mind. So I couldn't fully control it with intention alone. So that was a new thing for me. I didn't know that. So in order to learn how to control this emotion to perform this experiment, I had to learn more about how my subconscious worked, which I didn't know at the time. But the second thing I learned about that is I learned what specific intentions, right, caused my subconscious to do certain things, right? And because I now realized it wasn't actually my intention that was doing the work, it was my subconscious. We'll talk more about this process because the way the process works is you have to do something with your intention, and then you have to do something with your subconscious mind too. If you just do it with intention alone, it's going to work, but it's not going to work that well, right? So we'll talk more about, that's what all of the next chapter is about, is what you do with your actual subconscious in this process. But in this chapter, we're just going to talk about what you do with your intention in this process, which is just really for quantization. So I learned that certain intentions that when I produced certain intentions and then kind of expressed certain types of thoughts, it made my subconscious respond in a way that just made certain emotions easier to charge, specifically love emotion in this case. So what I would end up doing is I know this when I kind of play out certain stories and certain fantasies in my head, just imaginary stuff, I noticed that the love emotion would come in stronger, right? I would feel it more powerfully, right? Which I didn't know that emotions had anything really to do with that at the time. Like I said, I was just trying to will it. I just would say, feel more, right? That didn't work. So I noticed that when I started telling stories in my head and I started playing out certain random fantasies, right? Then that emotion would come in stronger and it would be easier to feel it. So I'm like, oh, okay, so there must be something about these that is innately related to this emotion, right? Because I couldn't charge it any other way. No matter what I did, it just wouldn't work until I would do this particular mental exercise or just playing out a story in my mind. So I'm like, and I would notice certain stories which would allow me to feel this particular shade of the emotion or this particular shade of the emotion, right? And the story would generally be the same for a particular emotion, like love emotion, but if I wanted to feel different shades of it, I'd have to change a story a little bit this way or a little bit that way. So I'm like, as I keep studying this, I learned that certain particular types of stories that I just play out in my mind were almost innately associated with particular emotions, which was interesting. I had never known that at the time. And also, I forgot to say, I would listen to certain kinds of music too at the same time. I'm listening to music and I know that certain types of songs would help me to feel this type of emotion. Other types of song would help me to feel this kind of emotion. If I wanted to feel this emotion with this song, it just wouldn't work, right? For whatever reason, that song my subconscious just would not respond to this song by switching to this frequency or just allowing me to feel this emotion more. So I started to get used to it, and I started to know which songs would be better for helping me to feel this particular emotion, right? So in other words, I started to get a better sense of how my intentions quantize my subconscious, what I had to do with my intention to get my subconscious to switch to a certain frequency so I could feel this emotion, right? So that basically is just a little bit of the story time. Well, I don't really consider it story time because we talked, I still think we talked enough about theory. But yeah, that's kind of was an experiment I performed And again, I started to learn more about the connection between intention and the subconscious. So what we're now going to talk about, pretty much for the rest of the chapter, is why that is. Why does my subconscious, and everyone's subconscious, why does it only respond in a way that allows you to feel a particular emotion to a specific song, or a particular type of story, or particular events in your life, right? If I'm like, let's say I'm in a boxing ring, right? So I'm fighting my opponent, right? It's going to be very hard for me in that situation to feel, I was going to say feel like I'm having fun, but no, you could probably have fun in that situation. It's going to be hard in that situation to feel, let's just pick a random emotion, like the feeling of inner peace, right? I know some people might say, well, no, if you enter a state of motion or whatever, right? But just indulge this example, right? You're probably not going to feel inner peace and relaxation, right? When you're in a boxing fight with your opponent, he's trying to punch you in the face, right? And so that circumstance is not favorable to that frequency, right? Why is that, right? Well, that basic idea is what the whole chapter is going to be about. Right, so yeah, that's pretty much it. Just wanted to set things up of what we're going to talk about and kind of how I came to these ideas. And so in the next chapter, we're going to begin our discussion on why that is, why the subconscious is specifically quantized by certain events and certain stories, right? And it has to do with what I call the absolute nature of the subconscious, right? So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.